we started?
It's blinking. Now let me back off just a little bit. It's saying recording, so I'm guessing it's recording. So go ahead.
Oh, okay. The last time I started talking about the nature, thinking about the nature and being of God, who God is, because I don't think that's well understood at this time. In earlier times, there was little known about God. In fact, it was all conjecture, and of course it turned out that all the myths and everything else that we have, that God was, he turned out in the experience of people very often to be very much a tyrant, obviously a being who was all-powerful, but also unpredictable, maybe even jealous, and they didn't know how to worship him or who he was even. And so they tried all manner of things in their efforts to, I guess I would say, appease him. But he wasn't a friendly individual necessarily. He was somebody you had to sort of cozy up to get any kind of help, and that was not easy to find either. Until really Jesus came along and gave an entirely different picture. But he gave only one aspect of God. If we're to understand him, it's an all-important aspect, but it still left us in the dark to a great many things. And that, of course, was his spirit. It's what he talked about. And we came out of that after he was crucified and went through a whole bunch, hundreds of years of people trying to figure out what it all meant. And they come to the point that we have various feelings about what he was. And that became really his nature, which we think of his nature as how he was, how his feeling toward us, what his feeling toward us was. And we come up with some philosophy that's come down through the ages. He's omnipotent and omniscient and omnipresent. That's part of it. And his the emotional aspect that we find that he gives us is, roughly speaking, all loving, compassionate, and forgiving. Summarizing it in that way gives us the indication that he's really a kindly person. But that didn't help solve the problem, because people felt that he was unapproachable. They couldn't, he was, at least in the worst case, inconsistent, if he was loving, compassionate, and forgiving. We couldn't figure out why bad things happen to good people, let's say. And we still haven't. But nevertheless, and that whole subject of being omnipotent and omniscient and omnipresent was never really understood. Philosophers talked about it, the earlier people in religion talked about it, but they fell into arguments, and it always came back to, as far as omnipotence is concerned, if God is so omnipotent and he's supposed to love us, why do we have such pain and misery? We try to ask him for help, but we never get it, or we don't think we get it always. Now, there's always been some Christians who rationalize that in a sort of a folksy sort of way by saying, of course, that God really loves us, but we can't understand it. And so they developed the idea, which I always heard when I was younger, is that God really loves us, but we're like a child who doesn't understand, and it's got to be disciplined. And so he caused a certain amount of suffering. And for many people, it was a great amount of suffering. that was supposed to bring us in line, with His will. Of course, we couldn't figure out what His will was. So the whole thing, Christianity, has always been in a dither about what God was really like. The Urantia book tells it that there's another aspect to God besides his wonderful nature that we hope exists and try to accommodate. And that is, of course, God is a person who creates. And as it turns out, the way Urantia understands it, as I see it, is that God can act, and when He acts, it depends on whether He's acting as the I Am, or whether or not the I Am is involved. If the I Am is not involved, God can go ahead and do anything He wants. Well, another aspect of God, which was not really recognized, I don't think, by the human race, is that God, when He acts independently. There was some understanding of that in the creation stories, and that He saw these things, he envisioned these things in His mind, and He created them, and that was the product of that, of course, was the universe. And He was able to do this because the I Am was not involved. His Spirit was not involved. That He could do this without affecting Spirit, because there was no Spirit in that creation. That is to say, there was no entity that He related to in a spiritual way. It was simply a physical creation. And science has been up on struggling for years, for centuries, and in the last 100 years or so, science has advanced enormously, and the Big Bang comes up as the way in which this creation was produced. And currently, there has been great advances made in understanding how that first creation came about, and the way that it functions. And so the Big Bang is a theory that has wide acceptance and or at least interest, and they're trying to discover ways of understanding it through the Big Bang. It's not completed yet, although the Higgs boson seems to be excite many people as being a source of understanding. But there's one aspect of it that they never have been able to fathom, and that involves entropy. It seems pretty obvious that the Big Bang was created as a very organized creation, and that's been the organization they've been struggling to understand for these many years. So it was highly organized. Well, the question in all of that, in other words, the Big Bang does not proceed as sort of an automatic thing. That anything automatic in this world, in this creation, tends to degrade and become chaotic unless it's supported some way. Well, it was supported in the Big Bang by some unknown way in which it was created. The creation obviously had, because, well, it occurs that way because entropy is disorder. And anything in this world that's left, and has been proven true, as far as I know, that anything that's left to itself without support will degrade into disorder. And there was a long time when the heat death, well, the degradation was in the form of all things that are organized would decay into heat, and all order would disappear. And the heat death was thought about I know in the last century, in the early part of the last century, I think it was still alive. Well, the question is, where did, if it's highly ordered, in order to be created, and it's highly ordered, because it needs to be highly ordered to be created, then where did the order come from? And that's the 800-pound gorilla in science. No one has an idea where it came from. Of course, religion believes it came from God. That God is a creator, and he created without interest, without the involvement of the I am. He could just create as he wished, and he did. Well, I think, of course, that he had it all worked out, and we've got to put it in a certain kind of order for us to understand it. But God creates not out of his own, out of some laws that are necessary. He creates out of his own nature, and his own nature is highly ordered. And so he created order, this creation, out of some highly ordered condition. He didn't suddenly discover order and start using it gradually, and some gradual process created the universe. He had it to begin with, and we see it developing as part of his nature just simply because we split out his nature into parts in order for us to understand it. Well, so God created, the Urantia book tells us that God created out of his own nature the original creation, apart from what came later in the creation story, which of course is the beginning of life and the eventually the human race. So that process has to be understood in the nature of God as two elements to his being: his spirit in the I am, and his power to create. Well, what's his power to create? Well, the way it's given, I think, in the Urantia book is that God's nature as a creator is his capacity to envision anything. Envisioning is like dreaming. We dream, we envision things, and more than that, it's more complicated for us because we also have hints of something different that has been created. That is, we have we envision too. We have our dreams. We call it envisioning for God because it's not so random and floating in the air and subject to magic and all sorts of things that dreaming is. It has a certain order to it for God. And so what's contained in him, we say, for him to use in creation, is all possibility for creation. That he has within himself, we might say, an imagination that's infinite. That everything possible exists within him, just like some of our dreams exist within us. But his are infinite and never-ending. He can go and go and go, and what he did was create by causing, by creating a universe in a form that makes him possible to experience everything, to experience everything what's in him, within him, as possibility. Well, that's infinite, never ending, and so it includes everything that's possible. So he set out, as anyone would who had that tendency within themselves, to use it. So he set out to create and experience everything possible. Well, he could do that infinitely in creating the master universe as a physical thing that does not involve the I am. But he also had the I am, which is basically gives meaning and value to whatever is done. The meaning and value is not in the creation of it; it's in the sense of its value and its meaning, which is spirit. And so, when he started to create, he discovered that his creations of the master universe, of the universe in which we live, the infinite cause and effect universe, the finite cause and effect universe. When he got into that mode, he wanted to create also from the I am. His first inclination was to create with the I am. It turned out that he could create without it in the physical universe, but his experience recognized that beings could exist, that he could exist somehow in the spirit of creation, that spirit could create too. And so the problem arose as how he was to handle that. Well, we call this in the Urantia book the unqualified absolute, that all possibility is the unqualified absolute. And that unqualified absolute creates. And that's his creative method without the use of the I am. Unfortunately, that type of creation is rather limited in its experience. God has only one experience of that kind of creation, with just his capacity to envision, without the I am. And he realized that the real creation was with the use of the I am. The kinds of creations he could make with just his possibilities for imagining, or we say envisioning in the Urantia book, were infinite. But they were always out there. He created them and he saw them. He saw them working, functioning, doing their thing. But he wasn't involved in it. It was already there. He created a thing. It was the thinging aspect of existence. And so what he desired to do was to create all of those possibilities and be a part of them in the sense of giving them meaning and value, in a sense of adding the I am to that creation. And that posed problems. In fact, it was the origin of the I am, that he realized the I am in our sequencing of things, which did not happen that way, but in the sequencing of it, he discovered that there was part of his being was missing, and he desired to create in the presence of the I am. And the result of that today is something we don't really recognize as being religious. We see the creation around us, and we put things together and make things and invent things because that's the way he set up the creation. Using the unqualified absolute, he could do that. And so what he wanted to do was to be able to experience that creation as the I am. But the question is how to work it in to that creation. So he set about the problem of doing so. Well, right away he ran into a brick wall, because the I am says that you can only create certain things that are consistent with it. So how do you put the two together? He couldn't create everything within the I am in order to experience it. Oh, he could, but he had a problem of figuring out how to do it. And so that problem is really the problem of perfection. The Urantia book calls it the ubiquity of deity. And by deity he means I amness. the ubiquity of that I amness for deity. You can't get around it and create without it and have the effects that you want.